And so this week's episode is entitled Man on Trial, because that's kind of what keeps happening throughout this. It's just Paul comes up on trial, says essentially the same thing, something happens, Paul comes up on another trial, says essentially the same thing, and on and on. And this happens, essentially, that is a rhythm of 4 of these trials in front of a successive number of Jewish and Roman officials. And so it ends, our passage tonight, or our kind of chunk tonight ends with one of the great plot twists of the New Testament. And certainly, if you were looking for the plot twist towards the end of the book of Acts, it comes up in tonight's scripture. It is Acts chapter 26, verses 30 through 32. Then the king got up, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those who had been seated with them. And as they were leaving, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor." So Paul's a Roman citizen, and through this series of trials, eventually Paul invokes his right, apparently, as a Roman citizen, to go to Rome and face an imperial tribunal. He did not trust the various officials on the local level. He certainly did not trust a Jewish trial in Jewish courts, as, well, we saw how that went with Jesus. We saw how that's been going with Paul. We saw what they did to James, son of Zebedee, right? He's been through a lot, and a lot of these proceedings he's been through have not been trustworthy. And so he essentially tied their hands, these officials, by wanting to go to Rome to see the emperor. But if he hadn't done that, he could have been released right then. He doesn't know that's how that was going to play out, but that's how it got played out. The dramatic irony of this, what gives this a ironic twinge, is that the very thing that Paul thought was going to save him is actually the thing that ends up condemning him, right? This has a real, end of Romeo and Juliet feel to it. One lover wakes up, spoilers, the end of Romeo and Juliet, right? By the way, they're the title characters of the Shakespearean play, ergo they're going to die. That's how that works in the tragedies. One lover wakes up, thinks the other lover is dead, kills themselves, then the other lover wakes up, realizes that lover is dead, and they're both dead, right? But this has that kind of feel to it, that kind of gut drop of, he's been through so much, he played this hand that he thought was going to save him, and instead, it is the thing that ends up condemning him. You feel for Paul. He has been through so much, and now he's going to have to go through so much more. I admit, every time I read this, right, the Bible doesn't have a lot of plot twists, where out of nowhere, surprise, right? A creation, I guess, is out of nowhere surprise. Theoretically, the resurrection of Jesus initially was very surprising. We just built the whole religion on it, and so we know that one's coming. But this one, unless you really know Acts, you don't know this is coming. And I feel for Paul. I feel that heart drop every time I encounter this scripture. Because in a real way, if this series has been entitled Near Misses of the New Testament, this one is a near miss gone wrong. But that is not where we start tonight. Because Paul had been hammering out near misses like a machine up until this point. In fact, Paul goes essentially 5 rounds tonight, and barely gets touched in any of them. And so let's look at round 1, which is Paul versus the council. The chief priest, Ananias, literally gets a hit on him, and that actually Paul gets beaten as a part of that. But Paul fights back and essentially plays the Pharisees off against the Sadducees in one of those things that show don't fight with Paul. Paul doesn't play fair. It is Acts chapter 23, verses 6 through 10. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, or angel, or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became so violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down and take him by force and bring him out to the barracks. Round one goes to Paul. Pretty handily. Yeah, they get a lick in on him. But then Paul reads the room really well. He knows all of this stuff as well as these guys. Realizes, it turns out the Pharisees and Sadducees, the thing we don't realize, because often we lump the two groups together. And Matthew's gospel does this in particular, right? It's just the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You think of them in one breath, and they all kind of rhyme, and they're all the weird Jewish people we don't quite understand. But actually, the Pharisees and Sadducees were way different and really did not like each other. Because the Sadducees were a super like scholarly clerical class, kind of like biblical court, like biblical temple lawyers. And the Pharisees were a reform movement in Judaism that in some ways Christianity looked a lot like, right? They end up at loggerheads because of kind of how they treat, specifically how they treat sinners, right? Christianity is being very welcoming of sinners. Pharisees pick the opposite trend. We're going to shun you until you behave better. But the Pharisees did not like the Sadducees. And Paul essentially starts a fight between Pharisees and Sadducees over the idea of resurrection, over the idea of spirits. And Paul exploits it and gets out of there. Back into Roman protective custody. Round one to Paul. It's a near miss. They could have done whatever. But then he got them fighting with each other. It's like one of those great scenes in the like a cartoon bar fight, right? Like, Bugs Bunny in old Western costume. Someone takes a swing at Bugs, but Bugs ducks. And so that guy punches that guy and punches the guy behind Bugs. And now they're in a fight and Bugs is in the back eating a carrot. That's 100% what this scene is. It's 100% what this is. Paul pulls something worthy of vaudeville comedy, gets one guy to miss him and punch the other guy, and now they're fighting, and he's just hanging out in the back until the Romans set him free. Again, near miss one, round one goes to Paul handily, like Bugs Bunny v. Elmer Fudd. It's great. Which brings us to round two. Paul versus the ambush. Paul's enemies within the temple hierarchy, within the Jews of Jerusalem, are, if persistent, if anything. And so they decide they're going to lay a trap for him. 40 men take essentially an oath that they're not going to eat until they kill Paul. Great, you're going to get really hungry. And then spoilers, then they trick the Romans into... They try to trick the Romans into having Paul moved from place to place so then they could spring the trap. I mean, again, this all looks like Looney Tunes right now. Now we're Wile E. Coyote versus the Roadrunner. The Wile E. Coyote is going to set this trap for Paul. They're going to try to jump him and kill him. They're going to try to ambush him. And so the son of Paul's sister, we didn't know Paul had a sister. Paul had a sister. The son of Paul's sister hears about it, tells Paul. Paul tells the Romans. And then we get Acts 23, verses 23 and 24. This is Paul as the Roadrunner. I didn't know this was a sermon about, when I wrote it, I didn't know this was about Looney Tunes. Then he, the leader, summoned 2 centurions and said, "Get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Also, mount for Paul to ride and take him safely to Felix the governor." Paul gets an armed escort out of Jerusalem to make sure they can't jump him, to take him to Caesarea. He gets essentially an entire Roman battalion to escort him out, and they even give him the courtesy of having a horse to ride. Paul gets a military escort to Caesarea and a chance for yet another trial on more neutral territory. Right? The other thing that's happening here is Paul is getting taken from Jerusalem, where the temple hierarchy have a lot of power, to Caesarea, which is modern-day Tel Aviv, by the way. If you're kind of wondering, where is this Caesarea we keep talking about? Vaguely where modern Tel Aviv and modern Israel is. So we're on the coast. It was a big port city built by Herod the Great to kind of honor his Roman overlords and try to create like a modern Roman city. That's why it's named after the emperor. It's named after Caesar. So it gets taken to this port city that is more Roman than it is Jewish, so that it is also more neutral ground. And now he's going to get tried in a more neutral court. He's going to get tried by Felix, the Roman governor. And so round 2 goes to Paul. This time with an assist from the son of his sister and an entire Roman battalion, but he gets there. Which brings us to round 3. Paul versus Governor Felix. I can't just say the governor because we're going to meet another governor here in a minute. So now we are in Caesarea, and the chief priest shows up, and the chief priest this time has brought a lawyer. This is this marvelous new innovation. This time, the chief priest, Ananias, won't be arguing the case. His lawyer will be arguing the case, and Paul is still representing himself because no one told Paul you could bring lawyers, I guess. Fun note about this particular chief priest. He is named Ananias, and this is kind of the main view we get of him. He was chief priest from like 48 to 53 AD, somewhere in there. He dies in a quite interesting way. He gets killed by Jewish rebels during the first uprising against the Romans in 66, so shortly after this whole episode, and they kill him because he was too close to the Romans and was viewed as a traitor to his people, which is exactly what happens in this scene. He shows up to the Roman governor to basically have someone killed who is actually keeping to Jewish law and is showing how close he is to the Romans. So he gets murdered in a rebellion for being too close to the Romans. Anyways, chief priest who gets murdered later, and lawyer shows up. Lawyer does all sorts of flattery. "Governor Felix, we know how good you are for the people." But you work for the chief priest. You're not supposed to think that. Doesn't matter. That's how that chief priest dies. "You've been so good to the people." And so then Paul gets up and basically says a thing he's going to say over and over and over again. The thing basically he said in front of the council that he says now is, "I did not break Jewish law. You have me here because some claim I broke Jewish law. I desecrated the temple. I didn't do any of those things. I also did not break any Roman law." Here, Acts 24, 22 through 27. And so this is kind of the result after Paul's his speech. I could read it. It's basically the whole chapter. But the Cliff Notes version is, I didn't do anything wrong in terms of Jewish law. I didn't do anything wrong in terms of Roman law. So, but Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourned the hearing with the comment, "When Lycia, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case." Then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but let him have some liberty, and not to prevent any of his friends from taking care of his needs. Some days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning faith in Christ Jesus, and as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away from my presence. When I have an opportunity, I will send for you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul, and for that reason, he used he used to send for him very often and converse with him. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So, round 3 does go to Paul, in that he doesn't get killed. But there's a caveat on this one. This one is not as clean-cut a victory. Felix doesn't kill him, which Felix definitely could have done. Instead, but Felix doesn't kill him and also doesn't agree to help the chief priest, right? The chief priest didn't get what he wanted. The actual argument made by the lawyer, okay. But turns out Felix is corrupt, and Felix wants money. And so Paul is potentially stuck in limbo for as many as 2 years, depending on how you read that sentence. That sentence can either read that Paul was in there for 2 years, or that Felix was in office for 2 years. Doesn't matter. Paul gets stuck in prison for a long time and faces another trial. Now, it's still a near miss in that Paul could have gotten killed and instead didn't. And the chief priest could have been given whatever he wanted and didn't. But Paul's stuck in prison, which leads us to round 4, which is Paul versus Governor Festus. We had Felix. Now we have Festus. New Governor Festus also kind of wants to get to know and feel out the temple hierarchy. And so Paul faces another trial. And we're starting to know this pattern extremely well. It is the hierarchy of the temple make elaborate accusations about how terrible Paul is, and how he broke this, and how he's inciting rebellion against the Romans, and how you definitely need to kill this guy, right? This keeps happening. And they do that again. And Paul gives a speech that is basically the mirror version of a speech we've heard before. I have done nothing wrong according to Jewish law. I have done nothing wrong according to Roman law. And this is also where Paul makes kind of his one fatal error. Let me take my case. I'm tired of this. Let me take my case to the emperor. Again, that turns out to be his fatal error. But Paul does not know that at this point. That only becomes clear later. All he knows is this is now his 3rd trial in 2 years, and he is just trapped in this circle of having to give the same speech to various people, Jewish and Roman, in order to try and get free. And so he says, I'm tired of this, let me go to the emperor. Festus, however, having listened to Paul, seems to agree with Paul in principle that there's nothing wrong here. That's Acts 25, 17 through 20. So when they met here, I lost no time. But this is Festus talking to King Agrippa. So when they met here, I lost no time, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they did not charge him with any of the crimes that I was expecting. Instead, they had certain points of disagreement with him about their own religion and a certain Jesus who had died, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Since I was at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem to be tried on the charges there. Festus kind of looks at this and goes, why am I dealing with this? This has nothing, in some ways, it's similar to what Pilate does with Jesus, right? Jesus gets brought before Pilate, and Pilate goes, this has nothing to do with me. What? Go away. Go back to them. This is literally not my department. Do you want to go back to the people whose department it is? No, you want to go to Rome? Okay, I don't care. I don't think you did anything, right? Again, you see the undertone of what Festus is getting at is, I don't think you did anything wrong. This doesn't matter. Okay, none of this makes any sense to Festus, so round 4 goes to Paul, which brings us to round 5. Now, this is Paul versus Herod Agrippa. And what? There we go. Olé. Paul versus Herod Agrippa. So, Festus basically punts it over to Herod Agrippa, saying, okay, Herod Agrippa happens to be there, and Festus is that conversation we just read is Festus talking to Herod Agrippa, and Festus hopes that Herod Agrippa can make sense of this. It's basically like, hey, you're Jewish, right? Why don't you talk to this guy? Because Lord knows I have no idea what he's talking about. I don't see anything that looks like a crime here. Can you talk to this guy and make sense of it? He's talking in gibberish. I don't care about this weird guy who rose from the dead. We do. Festus doesn't. So Paul, this time, at least gets to give a different speech. Instead, he basically gives Herod Agrippa his call story about how he was a Pharisee, how he was trained as one, how Christ spoke to him on the road to Damascus, and how then he got called to be the missionary to the Gentiles, to go out and do that. But then he also starts to get really theological on Herod, because even if Herod worked with the Romans, Herod was ostensibly a Jewish king who would have been raised in the Jewish tradition, and so would have known about the prophets, would have known about Moses, would have known about the promised Messiah. And so Paul goes, hey, why am I in trouble for having preached the very thing that our people have hoped for? Herod, you know as well as I do, we've been waiting for this. That's what I have been talking about. Essentially, appeals to Herod's faith and showing that he has been talking about the fulfillment of the prophecies, the fulfillment of the prophets, the hope of the people. And that's where you get the conclusion we've already read. Acts 26, 28 through 32. Agrippa said to Paul, and this is partly to show how well his argument hit home. Agrippa, the king, said to Paul, are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian? Again, like you hear, like Agrippa connects with what Paul is saying. Paul replied, whether quickly or not, I pray to God that not only you, but also all who are listening to me today might become such as I, except for these chains. Paul's being funny. Then the king got up, and with the governor and Bernice and those who had been seated with them, and as they were leaving, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor. He even convinced Agrippa. So yes, technically, round 5 to Paul, but back in round 4, he overplayed his hand. And so off he goes to Rome. One of the things I don't want us to lose sight of here is just how much Paul went through. It's why I went through this round by round by round, right? Because I wanted to hit just how much Paul went through in this kind of 2.5 year period. He went through a ton. He goes through 4 different trials. There were actually 2 different attempted ambushes. There is at least 1 beating and the implications of potentially more, and a 2-year false imprisonment and attempted extortion. And after all of that, he gets shipped off to Rome for what promises to be, at the very least, even more trials in front of even more officials, where he has to make this same case again. I did nothing wrong according to Jewish law. I did nothing wrong according to imperial law. Leave me alone. The sense I get of what is happening here and why I didn't just... we could have done 1 week on chapter 23 and 20, then on 24, and then on 25, and then on 26, and we could have analyzed his speeches in depth, but why I didn't do that, why I lumped them together, is essentially what I see Paul is doing here is he's doing whatever it takes to stay in the game. Over this 2-year period, this is a true example of the near misses of the New Testament, because he's doing whatever it takes to stay in the game. And you see how close it gets sometimes. Hey, my sister's son comes to me, hey, Romans, can you protect me? And the Romans do. Hey, Herod Agrippa, don't you remember the prophets? Yes, I remember the prophets. I almost believe what you're saying. It's just coming up with the right words, coming up with the next thing to keep him in the game, So I actually have a pretty good visual of what I think this is. And this, I don't do a lot of sports stuff from preaching because it kind of becomes a cliche. But I remember when I was in college, there was a Super Bowl game between the New York Giants and, well, it's been the past 20 years, and the New England Patriots. Right. It was an incredibly low-scoring game. And it all came down to one last drive being led by the Giants' then quarterback, Eli Manning. And if the tech is with us, I have a video clip.
The New York Football Giants and the New England Patriots in Super Bowl 42.
Patriots 18-0. We know all about their credentials. How did the Giants pull off one of the major upsets in Super Bowl history?
You know, if you're TiVo in the game, you just skip the rest and go to the fourth quarter.
Manning back to throw. Sets, looks over the middle. Boss makes the catch on the run. Still on his feet across midfield. To the 40, to the 35, and knocked down at the 34-yard line. And off, play fake. Manning to throw to the end zone. Touchdown! David Tyree on the post. And the Giants have the lead.
This is the position you want to be in. This is it. You got a chance to win the Super Bowl. The ball is in our hands.
Can Eli Manning do it? This is what every quarterback lives for.
Direct snap to Manning. Back to throw. The rush. Going to be hit. Going to be sacked. No, he got out of it. Now he fires downfield. And it is caught at the 24-yard line. How in the world did he do that?
How did he get away from that?
I have no idea.
What a play by the quarterback.
Eli falls in practice and trips when nobody's even around and by himself.
I can't say I saw David Tyree. I saw a white jersey in the middle of the field, and I said, I got to try to make something happen.
That right there let me know we're going to win this game.
39 seconds to go. Manning takes the snap, looks left, lobs it left. First, he's wide open. Touchdown, Giants! In the left corner of the end zone.
So you get the image, right? That moment where Eli Manning is able to, he's going to get sacked. He's not a big, beefy quarterback, right? He's a fairly small guy for football. His brother, Peyton's bigger than he is, and Peyton was no giant, right? This is little Eli. Little Eli somehow ducks out of that sack. He's playing against the Patriots at the kind of the height of their power. They're 18-0. They have not lost. All they've got to do is essentially sack Eli Manning on that drive, and they've done it. They've done the perfect season in the modern era, right? Except they can't, because he stays on his feet. He stays in the game. That's what Paul is doing round after round here. He is Eli Manning. He's up against an incredible force. He's up against the Roman Empire. He's up against the temple hierarchy. He doesn't stand a chance. He just stays nimble enough to stay in the game, like Eli Manning ducking out of that sack to then throw the pass that blows the game wide open, right? They were supposed to lose. When you were going, all the statistics tell you, you go in the fourth quarter down behind the Patriots, you're not going to win, right? Well, especially in 2009. They win because he is nimble. Paul does whatever it takes to stay on his feet. At any moment in there, he could have given up. And a lot of people would have, right? After trial after trial, after tribulation after tribulation, all of this coming after a long ministry that had its own trials and tribulations. And we were talking about, Paul essentially on and off since Acts chapter 9. And he has been beaten, and he has been stoned, and he has been arrested. And now here he is, trapped in prison for 2 years while the Romans try to extort him, put on multiple trials. The Jews are still trying to kill him. He could have thrown up his hands and said, whatever, just kill me, I know where I'm going. But he doesn't. He does whatever it takes to stay in the game. Strings together just the right words. Has the right people around him. It is near miss after near miss after near miss after near miss. And I actually think this is the message to us in our current moment. That one of our responsibilities as Christian people, not just in the 21st century, but I mean during this COVID-19 pandemic in particular, is to do whatever it takes to stay in the game. Do whatever it takes. We got to play smart. And we don't want to give up. Right? Because that's the thing Paul doesn't do. At no point does Paul stand up in front of the face of the Roman Empire or the face of the Jewish hierarchy and say, I can't do this anymore, I quit. No, at no point does he does that. He stays in the game. And I want to be clear what I mean by that. I don't actually mean necessarily about resisting what various governments and rules and all of that. No, I actually think the question is way bigger than masks or caps on church attendance or bans on singing or not. Those are issues that I think constitutional courts will have a field day with, when we can finally do that. But to me, that's not the actual core issue. The core issue for us as churches is to not fall into that mindset of, oh, I guess it doesn't matter. Oh, I'm just not going to be able to do anything anyways. Oh, this thing's going on. I'll just put that all on hold. I'll put the mission on hold. I'll set that aside for now. Because when you set it on the shelf once, it becomes much easier to set it on the shelf again. The real enemy we face, other than this disease, which itself is an enemy, is the enemy of apathy and hopelessness. When we feel like we can't do anything, so why bother? I hear that creep in to church, not conversations here, praise God, but I give this sermon as a reminder to us to not fall into that trap. But I hear that conversation. That, oh, it's just going to get canceled anyways, whatever. Oh, we're just not going to do that. Looking forward at something 6 months down the road. We have no idea. I have no idea what 6 months from now looks like. 6 months ago, I could not imagine this is what now would look like. So don't project 6 months. Don't cancel things that are 6 months away. We have no idea what 6 months from now looks like. We could have a vaccine or we could have martial law. It could be either. Right? Do not give in to that hopelessness. Because one of the things we see from Paul in this never-ending series of trials is he does what it takes to stay in the game. And this is where, honestly, my sermon becomes part sales pitch. This Sunday, we're going to vote on building a building. Right? I just got off the phone shortly while I was kind of breezed in here right before go, as I was on the phone with Marlon planning on how that vote was to take place. He's going to appear via video conference, and I got to figure out how on earth that's going to work, but that's my problem, okay? And there's a kind of sneaky logic, and I have felt it creep in the back of my mind of, oh, I don't know what the future is going to be like, let's not build it. Well, I know 4 months ago, before this broke out, we felt deeply convicted that we were supposed to build that building. And God knew this pandemic was coming, even if we certainly didn't. And so part of why I am pushing for us to have a vote, why I've been hounding Marlon, why we've organized a picnic in a pandemic, is to not give in to that creeping hopelessness, that creeping apathy. That thing that says, oh, it doesn't matter. The future is uncertain. The future was uncertain 6 months ago, clearly. I don't want us to give into that. And so that's why I am still pushing for us to build this building. Because our mission hasn't changed. And at some point, there won't be restrictions, and we're going to need a lot more space. And honestly, we could even be doing things better right now if we had more space. I could put y'all in one building, and I could put the youth in another building, and I could put the children in a whole separate wing. Right now, the youth are at Davy Dogwood Park because we literally have nowhere that's safe to put them. I don't want us to fall into that trap because I hear it. And that's nihilism. That's not the Holy Spirit. Paul went through a whole heck of a lot, right? And so he could have been sitting in that cell under Felix, and and given up. Or he could have just let the ambush take him. And he doesn't. He keeps fighting, actually so much, it ends up landing him in a trap he doesn't even know is coming. Part of our responsibility as Christians is to do whatever it takes to stay in the game. And so, look, if the government tells me, although I think it's illegal, if the government tells me I have to shut the doors again, I'll go back to preaching on the internet full time, right? And we'll go back to having the most ridiculous streaming setup of any church in Palestine, Texas, and one of the more ridiculous setups in the entire United Methodist denomination. I'll go back to doing that, because that's how we stay in the game. But we're also going to break ground on a building, because that's how we stay in the game. Our mission didn't change. Our mission field changed a little bit, but our mission didn't change. So we do whatever it takes to stay in the game. We play smart. We play creative. We dodge the sacks when they're running at us, even if they're from behind and we can't really see them. And we keep doing what God has asked us to do. Paul gets about at least four additional years of ministry, because he figured out how to set the Sadducees and the Pharisees off against each other. Because he figured out the right way to talk to Felix. Because he figured out the right way to talk to Festus. Because he figured out the right way to talk to Agrippa. Because, and we're going to hear next week, he continues his ministry. Paul gets years added to his ministry because he dances around like a Christian apostle version of Eli Manning in the 2009 Super Bowl. That's my challenge to us too, to live in that example. That if the New Testament, if I labeled Acts near misses of the New Testament, may the COVID-19 epidemic be merely yet another near miss in a long story of near misses, where we have just figured out how to stay in the game. Because the only way to win the game is to keep playing.